SBO is the best.
Alright, let's lock in. So by the end of this video, you'll be able to understand the structure and function of the bones, joints, and connective tissue. We're going to look at planes and axes, joint movements, and how to analyze them. We're going to look at the roles of muscles, so the agonist, the antagonist, and the fixator. We're going to look at the types of contraction and motor units, muscle fiber types, and how they help to create contraction. Okay, let's jump straight into the skeletal system. The skeletal system is made up of the bones in your body, and these are the functions of the skeletal system. So what do bones do? They support your body, they support the framework and the shape of your body, they protect your vital organs, they help to enable movement because bones act as levers that muscles can pull on. They also provide blood cell production, which happens in the bone marrow. And lastly, they store minerals that are important for muscle contraction and bone strength and for overall health. Okay, now we're going to look at joints. So a joint is simply where two bones meet. And you have a bunch of different types of joints. A lot of them don't move, but the ones we're looking at in this course are called synovial joints, which are joints that do move. So synovial joints are freely movable joints, and that's where movement occurs. Now, this is a simple diagram of what a joint would look like. You have one bone meeting another bone, and that's the joint right there. Now we're going to label it to look at the different parts of the joint. So a synovial joint looks something like this. This isn't very clear, so I'm going to rewrite that. So we have the ligaments, and ligaments are connective tissue that connect bone to bone. So ligaments connect bone to bone. We also have tendons. So imagine this is the muscle and this is a tendon right here that is connecting the muscle to the bone. So tendons are connective tissue that connect muscle to bone. Connect muscle to bone. Now we have something at the end of bones which we call cartilage or articular cartilage, and that's mainly there to reduce friction between the bones, and it helps to absorb shock as well. We also have these two structures here. First we have the joint capsule, and we have the synovial fluid, which both help to lubricate the joint to also reduce friction. So those are the parts of a synovial joint that you need to know. And always remember, tendons connect muscle to bone, meanwhile ligaments connect bone to bone. Okay, now we've spoken about bones and joints and how they help to allow movement, but let's talk about planes and axes of movement. So planes and axes of movement are one way we can analyze how movement actually happens. There are three planes you need to know, and the axes for those planes as well that you need to know. And the way I think about planes, right? Think about planes as just slices that split the body into two different parts. So the axes are like kebab skewers that go through the body. So for the frontal plane, as you can see here, it splits the body into front and back. Frontal plane here splits the body into front and back, and it's paired with the sagittal axis, which sort of is a kebab skewer that goes through the body from the front and comes out at the back. And the important thing about the frontal plane is the type of movements that it allows are abduction and adduction movements. So abduction and adduction movements. So these are things like a cartwheel, a side flip, walking or running sideways, like shuffling sideways, sidestepping, movements like that happen around the frontal plane and about the sagittal axis. Next, we have the transverse plane, which splits the body into top and bottom, as we can see here. And the transverse plane is coupled with the longitudinal axis. And the way you spell that is longitudinal axis, longitudinal axis, which sort of goes from the head to the toe straight through the body. And the important thing to know about movements that happen in the transverse plane about the longitudinal axis is that those movements are rotational movements. So it could be medial rotation or lateral rotation. We're going to look at the meaning of all these different types of movements later on in this video. But just think about any movement that has rotation in it. So a dancer might do a pirouette spin or something like that. That's going to be happening in the transverse plane around the longitudinal axis. Now lastly, for the sagittal plane, which splits the body into left and right, and it's coupled with the transverse axis, the type of movements that occur in the sagittal plane about the transverse axis are flexion and extension movements. So a lot of forward and back movements or flexion and extension movements, like doing a bicep curl, running, doing a front flip, back flip, and things like that. Now, before we go into detail at the individual joints, let's look at the definitions of joint movements. So a lot of the movements we spoke about when we were talking about planes and axes, we talked about abduction, adduction, rotation, flexion, and extension. These are the definitions of all those types of movements that you need to know. So flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, medial rotation, lateral rotation, circumduction. So fun fact about circumduction, it's actually a combination of flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction. So it's a combination of all these types of movements all in one. So these are the types of movements you need to know the definitions for. Now let's move on into looking at each joint, looking at the muscles that work in the joint and also the bones that are found around the joint. Okay, first things first, these are the bones of the body you need to know, starting from all the way at the top, the cranium, going all the way down to the foot, and from the back we have these two bones, vertebral column and the scapula. The vertebral column here is this huge structure made up of individual vertebrae, and it's really important to protect the spinal cord and to give the body stability. Okay, now that we know the different bones in the body, we're going to look at specific joints you need to know, and we're going to analyze the movements that happen in those joints and the main muscles that create those movements. First, get familiar with the muscles in the body so you know which muscles we're talking about when we are analyzing movements at each joint. So we're going to start with this front facing diagram here. First, we have the deltoids, which is your shoulder muscles. We have three parts of the deltoid. So we have the anterior deltoid, which is the front part of your shoulder, and the posterior deltoid, the back part of your shoulder, and these middle fibers here are referred to as the side deltoid, so the side part of your shoulder. Next, we have your pectoralis major, which is your chest muscle. Underneath, you also have a pectoralis minor, but the main one is the pectoralis major. Next, we have your biceps brachii. Then we have your wrist flexors. Then we have your quadriceps muscle at the front of your thigh. So your quadriceps are actually referred to as the quadriceps group because they are made up of these four muscles here. Then we have your adductors. Your adductors are also a group because they are made up of these three muscles here. Then we go down to your tibialis anterior, and then looking from the back, we have your trapezius around the neck, upper back area. So this muscle right here. So your trapezius, and then next we have your latissimus dorsi. These big muscles down here are your latissimus dorsi. Next, we have your triceps brachii at the back of your upper arm. You have your wrist extensors at the back of your lower arm, opposite direction to your wrist flexors, and the triceps is on the opposite position to your biceps brachii. Then we have the gluteus. So the gluteal muscles, we have three muscles. You have the gluteus maximus, gluteus medius, and gluteus minimus. So those are your bum muscles. Then at the back of your thigh, we have your hamstrings, which are made up of these three muscles. And then we have the gastrocnemius down here, and then the soleus, which are your calf muscles. So the gastrocnemius is at the front of your calf, and then the soleus is just underneath the gastrocnemius. So those are your calf muscles, and those are really the muscles you need to know when we analyze the joint actions. Okay, so let's start at the shoulder here. The shoulder is a ball and socket joint, and it's such a fascinating joint because it actually allows the greatest range of motion of any other joint in the body. So these are the movements that happen at the shoulder, followed by the muscles that contract to allow these movements. So flexion, which is basically where the arm goes forward, like up in front of you, and that is caused by the anterior deltoids with a little bit of help from the pectoralis major, but mainly the anterior deltoid. We have extension, which is the opposite, where your arms go backwards, and this is caused by the contraction of the latissimus dorsi with a little bit of help from the posterior deltoid, but mainly by the latissimus dorsi. Next, we have abduction, which is where your arm moves away from your body. So lifting your arms out to your side is an example of abduction, and this is caused by the deltoids contracting. Next, we have adduction, which is caused by your latissimus dorsi, and adduction is basically bringing your arm back towards your body. Next, we have horizontal flexion, which is moving your arm across your chest, and horizontal flexion is caused by contraction of the pectoralis major. Next, horizontal extension is the opposite, which is where your arm moves out, it moves back out from your chest, and this is caused by contraction of the posterior deltoid. Next, we have medial rotation. Medial rotation is internal rotation of the shoulder, and this is caused by a contraction of the latissimus dorsi with a bit of support from the pectoralis major, but mainly the latissimus dorsi. And we have lateral rotation, which is external rotation of the shoulder, and this is created by the contraction of the teres minor. Again, we're going to look briefly at the teres minor here. It's hard to see on these muscle diagrams, but we have to look at it from the skeletal diagram to really see what it looks like. So teres minor is like a band here, as you can see, and it's found on both sides of the shoulder, not just one side. So that same band would be here as well, and that's your teres minor, which is responsible for lateral rotation at the shoulder. Okay, now let's move on to circumduction. Circumduction is, again, like we mentioned before, a combination of flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction, and is created by a combination of different muscles, if not all the muscles, working together at the shoulder. All right, now let's look at the elbow. The elbow is a hinge joint and it allows two movements: elbow flexion and elbow extension. Elbow flexion is when you bend at the elbow, so the angle at the elbow gets smaller basically, and that is created by the contraction of the biceps brachii. Elbow extension is when you straighten your elbow, and that is created by the triceps brachii. Okay, next let's move on to the wrist. The wrist joint is a condyloid joint. Sometimes people refer to it as an ellipsoid joint, but you don't really need to know that for this course. But what you need to know is that the wrist is a condylar joint and it allows wrist flexion and wrist extension. Wrist flexion is caused by your wrist flexors. This is basically where you move your hand closer to your forearm, so like you're clenching onto something. And then wrist extension is where you straighten the wrist, and that is obviously created by your wrist extensors. Okay, now on to the hips. The hip joint is a and socket joint, ball and socket joint, and the movements that can happen at the hips are flexion, which is basically where the knee drives up, hip extension, which is where the leg drives back, hip abduction, which is where the leg moves out to the side away from the body, hip adduction, which is where the leg moves back closer to your body, hip medial rotation, which is basically when the hip rotates inwardly. So rotation of the leg inwardly is medial rotation. Lateral rotation is when you open up, so you rotate your legs outwardly. So footballers usually do an exercise called opening and closing the gates. Opening the gates is an example of lateral rotation. Closing the gates is an example of medial rotation. So flexion is created when this huge muscle in your hip area called the iliopsoas contracts, and the iliopsoas is one of those hidden muscles as well, so you can't see it clearly on an external muscle diagram like this. We have to look at the skeleton diagram. So the iliopsoas looks something like that. Like you can see these two huge muscles here are your iliopsoas. From the side it will look something like this from the side, and that's your iliopsoas. Really, really, really important muscle, the iliopsoas. Then hip extension is caused by your gluteus maximus contracting. Hip abduction is caused by both your gluteus medius and your gluteus minimus. Hip adduction is caused by your adductors. So remember we looked at the adductor group with those different muscles in there. Hip medial rotation is caused by the gluteus medius and the gluteus minimus. Hip lateral rotation is caused by the gluteus maximus. Alright, now let's look at the movements at the knee. The knee is a hinge joint and it allows two movements, flexion and extension. So knee flexion is bending of the leg at the knee, and this is triggered by the hamstrings contracting. Knee extension is straightening of the knee, and this is created by the quadriceps group contracting. Remember we looked at the groups of muscles that are found within these two muscle groups. This isn't necessarily essential knowledge, but something extra if you want to know and if you want to impress the examiners is that the hamstring group, as much as it helps with flexion, it can also help with hip extension. And the quadriceps group, as much as it's the main muscles that help with knee extension, it can also help with hip flexion. Alright, now let's zoom in on the ankle and the different movements that happen at the ankle. So the ankle is a hinge joint. The ankle is a hinge joint, and it allows two movements, dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. These are very straightforward definitions. So dorsiflexion is basically the movement you do when you point your toes upwards. So it's any movement where your foot is moving closer to your lower leg. So toes up is dorsiflexion, and that is created by the tibialis anterior muscle contracting. Toes down is plantar flexion, any movement where your foot is moving away from your lower leg, that's plantar flexion, and that's created by the gastrocnemius contracting and also the soleus. Okay, all of these muscles we've just looked at that contract to enable these movements to happen are the agonists. And we have three functional roles of muscles. Apart from the agonist, we also have the antagonist and the fixator. So for all of those movements we've looked at, to be able to determine what the antagonist is, think of the muscle that is opposing the movement, either by relaxing, lengthening, or by contracting eccentrically. That would be the agonist. And the fixator are muscles around the joint or the body area that help to stabilize so that the agonist can work effectively. So let's look at some examples of what the antagonists would be in certain movements. Okay, starting from the shoulder, we have shoulder flexion, which, as we've defined, shoulder flexion is where the arm goes forward and up in front of you. The agonist, like we mentioned, is the anterior deltoid, and this movement is also supported by the pectoralis major. But the antagonist, the muscle that opposes this movement, is the latissimus dorsi. And some examples of shoulder flexion in sports are any front raise, so raising your arm to shoot a basketball, or when you're sprinting and you drive your arm forward, or throwing a jab in boxing. Next, shoulder extension. This is where your arm goes backwards. We've looked at the latissimus dorsi and posterior deltoid being agonist, but the antagonist for this movement would be the anterior deltoid and also the pectoralis major supporting as well with the antagonistic work. Examples of shoulder extension could be when you're rowing and in the pulling phase of rowing, that would be shoulder extension, or any backswing in any striking action. So if you backswing before you punch, or if you backswing before you throw a ball in baseball, that is an example of shoulder extension. Next, shoulder abduction. This is where we're moving the arm away from the body towards the side. We've looked at the agonist for this, which would be the middle deltoids. So the antagonist muscle for, or muscles for shoulder abduction would actually be the latissimus dorsi and the pectoralis major. Examples of shoulder abduction movements are star jumps. So when you're moving your arm away from your body in a star jump, if you're doing a lateral raise exercise in the gym, or when a goalkeeper dives and reaches their arm wide to be able to save a football shot. Next, we have shoulder adduction, which is where you're bringing your arms back towards your body. Again, we've mentioned the agonist for this is the latissimus dorsi. The antagonist for shoulder adduction is the deltoid. Examples of shoulder adduction are pulling down. So if you're climbing or you're doing a pull-up, you're going to be pulling on whatever you're holding up to, and that is an example of shoulder adduction. And also when you're swimming, you have a phase where you pull on the water. That is an example of shoulder adduction because the arm is moving back closer to the body. Next, we have shoulder horizontal flexion. We've mentioned shoulder horizontal flexion is the movement of your arm across your chest, and the agonist is the pectoralis major. Now, the antagonist muscle for shoulder horizontal flexion is the posterior deltoid. Examples of shoulder horizontal flexion are doing a chest pass, a punch in boxing, or during a bench press when you're pushing the weight up. Those are examples of shoulder horizontal flexion. Now, onto shoulder horizontal extension. This is where your arms are moving back out away from the chest. and we've mentioned that the agonist for this movement is the posterior deltoid, but the antagonist for this is the pectoralis major. Examples of horizontal extension at the shoulder are rowing or pulling your arm back for a throw. Next, we have shoulder medial rotation. We've mentioned this is the internal rotation of the shoulder, and the agonists for this are the latissimus dorsi and pectoralis major. The antagonist is the teres minor, that tiny band of a muscle that we looked at. Examples of medial rotation at the shoulder is the follow through when you're throwing a cricket ball or a baseball, and also in swimming during the pool phase of swimming, you're also using some shoulder medial rotation. Next, we have shoulder lateral rotation. This is external rotation of the shoulder, and the agonist is the teres minor. The antagonist is the latissimus dorsi and the pectoralis major. Examples of lateral rotation at the shoulder are before you throw, that phase where you sort of cock the ball, right? So the cocking phase where you sort of prepare to throw a ball, or in a tennis serve, before you serve, you have a preparation phase, right? Those are examples of lateral rotation at the shoulder. Lastly, circumduction. Again, we mentioned there's a bunch of muscles working all together. So whatever muscles are working, the antagonist of those muscles would also be relaxing, lengthening, or contracting eccentrically to allow circumduction to happen in real time. Now, let's look at the elbow and the antagonist. Very straightforward. For flexion, because the agonist is the biceps brachii, the antagonist would be the triceps brachii. Examples are bicep curl or pulling in rowing or doing a chin up. Those are examples of elbow flexion. Elbow extension, because the agonist is the triceps brachii, the antagonist would be the biceps brachii. Examples of elbow extension are when you're doing a push up, when you're actually pushing, so the upward face of a push up would be elbow extension. When you're doing a pass in netball, when you release the netball, that is elbow extension because you're straightening your arms. And also when you're throwing a shot put, when you actually release the shot put, you're straightening your arms, and that is elbow extension. Now let's move on to the wrist. Again, very straightforward. Wrist flexion, the agonist is the wrist flexors. So the antagonist for wrist flexion would be the wrist extensors. Wrist extension, on the other hand, the agonist is the wrist extensors, the antagonist is the wrist flexors. Examples of wrist flexion are in a basketball shot when there's a flick at the end of the shot. That is an example of wrist flexion. And also in a badminton net shot, that wrist flick action is an example of wrist flexion. Now, examples of wrist extension in sports are when you control the racket face in tennis. So you're holding a racket and controlling the face of the racket in tennis to be able to strike the ball properly. That's an example of wrist extension. And also that position you put your wrist in to be able to put you in a good position to catch the ball is wrist extension, where you sort of straighten out your palms and open up your hands. That's an example of wrist extension. Now at the knee, hip flexion, which was spoken about, that's where the knee drives up. The agonist for hip flexion is the iliopsoas. The antagonist is the gluteus maximus. Examples of hip flexion are when you're sprinting and you drive your knee upwards, that's hip flexion. When you're doing a high knees exercise, that's hip flexion. Now let's move on to hip extension. Hip extension is where the leg drives back. The agonist for this is the gluteus maximus, like we've looked at, and the antagonist is the iliopsoas. Next, we have hip abduction. This is where your leg moves out away from the body to the side, and the agonists for this are the gluteus medius and the gluteus minimus, like we've spoken about. The antagonist for hip abduction are the hip adductors. Examples of hip abduction in sports are doing a sidestep. If you're a defender in football or basketball, it's usually a sidestep movement that the defenders do. That is hip abduction. And also if you're dancing and you might do a dance side lift, that is hip abduction. Or if you're balancing on one leg, The leg that isn't balancing would be swinging out to the side and in all different directions. That is hip abduction, because that leg is sort of swinging away from the body to help provide a counterbalance. Now for hip adduction, where the leg is moving back towards the midline of the body, the agonist, like we're spoken about, is the adductors. So the antagonists is the gluteus medius and the gluteus minimus. Next, we have hip medial rotation, which is internal rotation of the leg at the hip. And the agonist for this, which we have talked about, is the gluteus medius and the gluteus minimus. The antagonist is the gluteus maximus. And for hip lateral rotation, which is external rotation of the leg at the hip, the agonist that we've talked about is the gluteus maximus, and the antagonist are the gluteus medius and gluteus minimus. Okay, now onto the knee. It's very straightforward. Knee flexion, which is bending the leg. The agonist that we've talked about is the hamstrings group. So the antagonist for knee flexion would be the quadriceps group. Similar thing for knee extension, which is straightening the leg. The agonist would be the quadriceps group. So the antagonist for knee extension is the hamstrings group. Now, onto the ankle. For the ankle, we have dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. Dorsiflexion is the movement where your toes move up. The agonist for that, which was spoken about, is the tibialis anterior. So the antagonist for dorsiflexion is the gastrocnemius and the soleus. Examples of dorsiflexion are clearing the ground when you run and also preparing the foot for landing. Plantar flexion is the toes pushing down away from the lower leg, and the agonist we've spoken about is the gastrocnemius and the soleus, and the antagonist for ankle plantar flexion is the tibialis anterior. Examples of plantar flexion are taking off in a jump or doing a calf raise. Alright, now we've looked at some movement analysis at the joints. We've looked at the actual actions, movements that happen at the joint, and the agonists that cause those movements to happen. We've also looked at the antagonists that oppose the movement. We've looked at the roles of muscles, agonists, antagonists, fixators. This is really important when we're going to look at something called jam analysis later on in this video. So let's carry on. There are three types of contractions you need to know. The first two are types of isotonic contractions. We have concentric and eccentric. Concentric basically means the muscle shortens, and eccentric basically means the muscle lengthens. Isotonic as a whole just means that the muscle is changing length while producing force. And the third type of contraction is isometric contraction. This is where the muscle produces force but the length stays the same. Okay, now let's talk about jam. What did I mean by jam earlier? So jam is a really amazing template to use to be able to revise movement analysis questions. So jam is an acronym and that stands for the joint. So the joint at which the movement is taking place, and then the action, and then the agonist, and then the antagonist, and then the muscle contraction, the type of contraction, whether it's concentric, eccentric, or isometric, and you can add more dimensions to this. This is why it's such an amazing way to revise and to help you answer questions. And this was actually introduced to me by my A-level PE teacher. Shout out Mr. Barclay. So we can even add more dimensions to this. We can say another M is muscle fiber type, and we're going to look at that later on in this video. Basically, use jam for your revision. Use jam and write out the joint action, agonist, antagonist, muscle contraction, muscle fiber type of any movement that you are analyzing. This will help you to be able to answer the questions that come up in your exam a lot more easily. All right, now let's explore muscle contraction. Let's look at what actually happens and how the nervous system switches on your muscle to be able to contract and to do things with your body. So Let's look at some key definitions. First, we have motor unit. A motor unit is made up of one motor neuron plus all of the fibers that it connects to and it controls. And the way a motor unit gets switched on or activated is that there is a nerve impulse that gets sent to the motor neuron. This nerve impulse is referred to as the action potential. So an action potential travels down the motor neuron and it causes a neurotransmitter to be released at the neuromuscular junction. This neurotransmitter is called acetylcholine, very important substance. It's released at the neuromuscular junction, and this helps the nerve impulse to be able to travel from the motor neuron into the actual muscle fibers, which triggers a muscle contraction. And you need to know that muscle contractions follow a certain principle, a certain law known as the all or none law, which states that for an individual motor neuron, if the stimulus, so the stimulus being that nerve impulse, is sufficient, all the muscle fibers that it supplies will contract fully. But if the stimulus is not sufficient, none of the muscle fibers that it supplies would contract at all. So that is the all or none law. So you might be asking, well, how do we control and create different levels of force? Because sometimes you don't want to use 100% of your strength, you only want to use 20% or 50%. Well, we can create different force levels by recruiting more motor units and by increasing the rate of nerve impulse firing. Okay, now let's look at the different muscle fiber types. So as an overview, this is what they look like relative to each other. The slow oxidative is the smallest one, the fast oxidative glycolytic is the largest one, and the fast glycolytic is the second largest one. These are the characteristics of the slow oxidative muscle fibers. So they produce lower amounts of force. They are very fatigue resistant, so they can work for long periods of time, and they are best for any endurance work. So marathons and long distance cycling and activities like that. And also it's important to know that they use aerobic respiration, meaning they release energy using oxygen. Next, we have the fast oxidative glycolytic muscle fibers. These produce medium-high force. They are better for fatigue resistance than fast glycolytic fibers, but they're not as fatigue resistant as slow oxidative fibers. So they are useful for repeated high intensity work. And fast oxidative glycolytic fibers can use both aerobic and anaerobic respiration to be able to generate energy. Lastly, we have fast glycolytic muscle fibers. They have the highest force output of the three, but they fatigue very quickly. In just a few seconds, they fatigue, and they are better for short explosive actions. And fast glycolytic muscle fibers use anaerobic respiration to release energy. Anaerobic respiration. And also rough timings of how long these muscle fibers work for. Slow oxidative muscle fibers can work for any activity that lasts 3+ minutes. Fast oxidative glycolytic works for any activity that lasts for 10+ seconds up onto 3 minutes. And fast glycolytic muscle fibers work only for 10 seconds before the fast oxidative glycolytic takes over, and then once the fast oxidative glycolytic gets fatigued, then the slow oxidative takes over. Muscles are recruited or switched on, turned on, following a pattern. So the slow oxidative muscle fibers are recruited first, and then the fast oxidative glycolytic are recruited second, and then the fast glycolytic are recruited third. Lastly, before we end the video, the reason why I'm really emphasizing jam is because sometimes movements don't seem how they seem. So let me give you an example of a movement that most students will probably get wrong because they haven't practiced using this jam structure, which is why I encourage you again to check out our website Super PE Online for a bunch of revision resources to help you prepare for exam questions. But let's look at a type of jam analysis that most students would get wrong, right? So let's say we are analyzing what happens at the knee when you are landing from a jump. So when you're landing, we're looking at the knee joint, which is a hinge joint. You're landing. What happens is that the action is knee flexion because you're landing, you're bending your knee. It's happening around the sagittal plane. So again, the good thing about jam is you can always add more letters. We can add a P there for the plane, sagittal plane, around the transverse axis. And the agonist, most students might say the agonist here is the hamstrings because the knee is flexing, the knee is bending. But that's why it's important to practice your jam, because if you really think about it, when you're landing, you have a lot of gravity, a lot of external force that is acting on the knees. So the muscles around the knees need to help to slow down that land to make it a safe landing. So the main muscle action is that the quadriceps contract eccentrically to control knee flexion and to absorb impact. So in this case, the quadriceps group, which are the group of those four muscles we looked at, would actually be the agonist, and the antagonist in this case would actually be the hamstrings. The hamstrings. Type of contraction would be eccentric for the whole movement, because eccentric usually happens when you're slowing down and coming down. Concentric is usually when you're going up and pushing off. So the muscle contraction type would be eccentric for this movement, and the muscle fiber type really depends on how intense the jump is. But assuming that this is an intense jump, which is why we need to really cushion a lot of the force, we can assume that we'll be using our fast glycolytic muscle fibers to be able to generate a lot of force through those muscles to help to stabilize the knee joint. So this is an example of something that would trip up most students because they haven't practiced over and over and over again using jam analysis and using past paper questions and using a lot of the practice worksheets that we have on the Super PE online website. So make sure you practice, because you can't just wing this. Okay, all right, that's it for this video. See you in the next video.